At my cousin's wedding, my family told me to keep quiet and not embarrass them. But when I realized 100 guests were about to eat poisoned seafood, I had a choice: stay silent or save everyone. I chose to speak up, and nothing was ever the same again. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. The memory of that day is still sharp in my mind, as if the scents, sounds, and emotions were etched into my senses forever. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a wedding filled with laughter, music, and the promise of new beginnings. My cousin, the bride, looked radiant in her gown, and the hall buzzed with the kind of excitement that only weddings can bring. But underneath that beauty, tension brewed in a quieter, invisible way. For me, the day was not just about witnessing vows. It became about making a choice that would change the entire course of the celebration. From the very start, I felt the familiar weight of my family's expectations pressing down on me. "Don't embarrass us today," my mother had whispered as she straightened my dress collar earlier that afternoon. It wasn't the first time I'd heard those words. They were practically a family mantra, repeated at every gathering, party, or social event. The subtext was always the same: keep quiet, don't make waves, and above all, protect the family's image. That demand had shaped much of my life. If I'm being honest, I'd grown up learning to swallow my concerns, to smile when I wanted to frown, and to keep silent when I should have spoken up. My relatives were obsessed with appearances. How others perceived us mattered more than truth, more than comfort, more than even safety sometimes. I'd long accepted that their warnings weren't really about me, but about their fear of gossip and judgment. And still, those words rang in my ears as I stepped into the banquet hall. "Don't embarrass us." I remember standing near the entrance, scanning the rows of tables draped in white linen, the glittering chandeliers overhead, and the serving staff weaving between guests. It was the kind of wedding people would talk about for months, maybe even years. Everything looked perfect on the surface, but I was used to noticing details others ignored. And that day, it was those small details that unsettled me. When I passed the buffet tables, I caught a faint, unpleasant odor. The kind of smell you hope you imagined but can't shake once you've noticed it. My eyes lingered on the platters of seafood, mountains of shrimp, oysters on ice, trays of delicate fish garnished with lemon and parsley. It should have looked mouth-watering, but instead, a sick feeling began to creep into my stomach. Something wasn't right at first. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe it was just me being sensitive. Maybe I was overreacting again, as my family so often claimed. But the longer I stood there, the stronger the smell seemed. My heart beat faster as I glanced around at the line of guests already forming, plates in hand, eager to dig in. 100 little calculations ran through my mind in those seconds. If I spoke up, people would stare. My family would glare. My parents would lecture me later about ruining the wedding. But if I stayed quiet and something really was wrong with that food, what would the consequences be? That was the impossible choice that confronted me before the celebration had even truly begun. And as I stood in that glittering hall, with laughter echoing around me, I realized that the day wasn't just about vows and champagne. It was about whether I would finally break the pattern of silence that my family had drilled into me, or whether I would let fear of embarrassing them keep me quiet. While people suffered, that was the moment I knew something terrible was about to unfold. My family has always been complicated. On the surface, We were the kind of people who looked polished and well-mannered at public events. We wore matching outfits for photographs, smiled politely at strangers, and kept our private struggles tucked neatly away. To outsiders, we seemed enviably close-knit, but the reality was different. Underneath the polished exterior ran a current of fear of gossip, fear of shame, fear of being the subject of whispers in the community. And in that family dynamic, I always seemed to be the one they worried about most. I was the one who asked too many questions, the one who noticed things others didn't, and the one who often pointed out when something seemed wrong. My parents, my aunts, and even my cousins thought of me as the dramatic one, the one who blew things out of proportion. They never quite understood that I wasn't seeking drama, I was simply observant. But being observant in a family that valued silence and appearances was like being a bird trapped in a cage. That afternoon, as the wedding began, I slipped into my usual role, quiet observer. My mother and father were all smiles, shaking hands with relatives and greeting guests as if nothing else in the world mattered. My aunt, the mother of the bride, fluttered about nervously, making sure everything looked perfect. And my cousin, the bride, looked breathtaking. I caught myself smiling as she walked past me, her eyes bright with joy, her veil trailing behind her like a cloud. She deserved happiness, and I wanted nothing more than for her day to go smoothly. But of course, there were others. My extended relatives filled the hall, each one carrying their own quirks and judgments. My uncles bragged loudly about their businesses, while my cousins whispered about who was wearing what. That was the rhythm of family gatherings, everyone competing in small, subtle ways, always trying to outshine the other, always pretending everything was perfect. And then there was me. I felt like an outsider, even among my own blood. I never quite fit the mold they wanted me to. I didn't care for gossip. I wasn't interested in putting on a show for strangers. And, most importantly, I couldn't ignore the truth, no matter how inconvenient it was. That day, my role was clear. Stay quiet. Don't embarrass the family, and blend into the background. My parents made that expectation crystal clear. Before the ceremony, my father had leaned down, adjusting his tie, and whispered, "Please, don't say anything today. We just want things to go smoothly." His eyes lingered on me, as if he already suspected I'd find something to disrupt. I wanted to roll my eyes, but instead, I nodded, swallowing my retort. It wasn't worth the argument, not at that moment. I told myself I would keep the peace, that I wouldn't cause any unnecessary trouble. But deep down, I knew how fragile their perfect picture really was, because I also knew my family's greatest weakness, their obsession with appearances. For them, public embarrassment was the worst kind of crime. They would rather hide a truth, even a dangerous one, than admit a mistake in front of others. That was the culture I had grown up in, and it was the same culture that would soon put 200 wedding guests at risk. It's strange how ordinary moments can conceal the beginnings of disaster. As I walked through the hall that day, greeting relatives, smiling for pictures, and nodding along to conversations I didn't care about, I felt the undercurrent of tension in myself. Something was brewing, though I couldn't yet name it. Looking back, I can see the warning signs. The smell of the seafood, the way the servers moved nervously when I passed by, even the too bright smile of the caterer when he reassured my aunt that everything was perfect. At the time, though, I was still clinging to the hope that maybe I was imagining things. Maybe, for once, nothing would go wrong, and I wouldn't have to choose between keeping the peace and speaking the truth. But deep down, I think I already knew that the role my family had cast me in, the dramatic one, The one they begged not to embarrass them was about to collide head-on with reality. And when it did, the cost of silence would become too high for anyone to ignore. The first real crack in the day's perfect surface came when I wandered near the buffet line, just as one of the servers lifted the lids from the seafood trays. At first glance, everything looked beautiful. The shrimp glistened, the oysters sat neatly on crushed ice, and the fish was garnished with slices of lemon that caught the light like jewels. But then the smell hit me again, sharper this time, undeniable. It wasn't the briny freshness of the ocean. It was sour, almost metallic, with that faintly sweet rot that comes when seafood turns. I froze, staring at the food as guests began to shuffle toward it. My heart thudded in my chest, the way it does when your instincts scream that something is wrong. A thought flickered in my mind. Maybe it's just me. But then I caught the expression of one of the younger waiters, a boy barely in his 20s, shifting nervously as he adjusted the trays. His face was pale, his movements jerky. I stepped closer and lowered my voice. "Is everything all right with the food?" I asked him. He startled, his eyes darting toward the head caterer before whispering back, "Honestly, I don't know. One of the deliveries came in late, and some of it wasn't stored properly, but it's already plated. There's nothing I can do." The words hit me like a slap. Nothing he could do? 200 people, children, elderly relatives, the bride herself were about to eat this. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I tried to steady my breathing. "But if it's spoiled..." He shook his head quickly, cutting me off. "Please, don't say anything. I'll get in trouble. It'll ruin everything. Ruin everything." That was the phrase that echoed through my mind. It was the same logic my family had lived by for decades. Better to cover up. Better to stay silent. Better to risk suffering later than to face embarrassment now. I looked back at the trays, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a matter of gossip or appearances. This was poison dressed up in garnishes and ice. I did the only thing I could think of. I hurried to my parents. They were standing near the head table, chatting with relatives and smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. I tugged at my mother's sleeve, pulling her aside. "Something's wrong with the seafood," I whispered urgently. "It's spoiled." I just spoke to one of the waiters. He admitted it wasn't stored right. "We need to stop them from serving it." Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then her face hardened. "Not today," she hissed. "Do not start this nonsense at your cousin's wedding." I blinked at her. "This isn't nonsense, Mom. People could get sick." But my father cut me off, his jaw tight. "We told you before we came here. Do not embarrass this family. Do you want to humiliate your aunt and ruin your cousin's wedding?" I stared at them, stunned. Humiliate them? By preventing food poisoning? By stopping 200 people from vomiting or worse? On what was supposed to be the happiest day of my cousin's life? My chest burned with frustration. They weren't listening. They never listened. To them, my warning wasn't concern, it was drama. I was falling into the role they'd written for me before I could even stop it. My aunt noticed the tension and swept over, her face tight with stress. "What's going on here?" she demanded. My mother gave me a sharp look before answering smoothly. "Nothing, just nerves." But I couldn't stay silent. I leaned closer to my aunt and said, "The seafood, it's gone bad. You can't let them serve it." Her eyes widened in horror, then immediately narrowed with something sharper. Fear of scandal. She grabbed my wrist and hissed, "Do you realize what you're saying? Do you realize what people would think if you started shouting about poisoned food at a wedding? Don't you dare cause a scene. Not today." Her grip was cold and unyielding. For a moment, I felt like a child again, being scolded into silence. but the smell still lingered in my nose. And in my mind I saw plates piled high with spoiled shrimp, glasses raised in toasts, laughter turning to choking and gasping. I couldn't shake the image of children doubled over in pain, or elderly relatives collapsing. That was the line. That was the moment I realized silence wasn't an option anymore. I might have been dismissed as dramatic, even shamed into quiet in the past. But now it wasn't just my dignity on the line. It was everyone's health. And no amount of not embarrassing the family could make me swallow that truth. I wish I could say that once I spoke up, things got easier. But that isn't how my family operates. The harder I pushed, the harder they pushed back. As though their pride weighed more than the safety of 200 people. I stood there, torn between panic and disbelief, while my aunt tightened her grip on my wrist. Her voice was low, but it carried the sharpness of a blade. "You will not ruin this wedding," she whispered. "Do you hear me? People are already serving themselves. If you scream about poisoned food now, you'll destroy everything we've worked for. Do you want this day remembered for that?" Her words were like ice water poured over me. For her, this wasn't about the truth, it was about memory, about appearances, about making sure her daughter's wedding was remembered as perfect. Even if that perfection was a lie. I glanced past her at the buffet. Guests were already spooning shrimp onto their plates. One elderly uncle had a mountain of oysters balanced beside a pile of crab legs. Children darted through the line, their plates nearly overflowing. My stomach lurched. I imagined them getting sick within hours, the music replaced by chaos and panic. Ambulances pulling up to the glowing wedding hall. "I can't just ignore this," I said, my voice trembling but firm. But my aunt snapped back. "Yes, you can. And you will. For once in your life, just stay quiet." The words cut deep because they echoed every criticism I'd ever heard. My whole life, I'd been told to tone it down, to be less, to stop being so difficult. And now, in this critical moment, my family was doubling down on that narrative. They wanted me to bite my tongue, even if it meant risking lives. I turned to my parents again, hoping for some kind of support. My father's expression was stony. "Enough," he said sharply. "Not another word about this. Do you understand? This is your cousin's big day. Do not make it about you. About me." The accusation stung. They thought I wanted attention, that I was stirring up trouble for the sake of it. But all I wanted was to prevent a disaster. The worst part was the way other relatives began to notice the tension. My cousins exchanged glances. One of my uncles raised an eyebrow. My family's greatest fear was already coming true, not because I'd said anything publicly, but because they were making such a scene trying to silence me. My mother leaned in close, her voice tight and brittle. "You're overreacting, as usual. The food is fine. Do not embarrass us." "Do you want people whispering that our family is hysterical?" I wanted to scream. Hysterical? How was it hysterical to stop people from eating spoiled shellfish? I looked back at the buffet again, my heart racing. A little boy had just picked up a shrimp and popped it into his mouth. I actually gasped out loud, my hand flying to my chest. My aunt's eyes flashed with fury. "Pull yourself together," she hissed. "You're making a spectacle." And in that moment, I realized the full weight of what I was up against. It wasn't just spoiled seafood I was fighting. It was decades of family pride, of denial, of silencing anything that might cause embarrassment. The more desperate I became, the more stubborn they grew. And with every minute that passed, more plates were being filled, more mouths about to taste what I already knew was dangerous. The stakes weren't just high, they were unbearable. Asterisk, there's a moment in life when fear gives way to clarity. When the pressure to conform shatters beneath the weight of something far greater. For me, that moment came as I watched my 6-year-old niece approach the buffet line with her tiny plate in hand. She was radiant in her little dress, the white lace hem brushing her ankles as she bounced on her toes, eager to taste the food that glittered beneath the chandeliers. She reached for the shrimp with a smile that only a child could wear, innocent, trusting, utterly unaware of danger. My breath caught in my throat. In that instant, all the family politics, all the warnings not to embarrass anyone, all the sideways glares, they vanished. All I could see was her small hand clutching the tongs, placing one pink shrimp after another onto her plate, each one a potential threat to her health. The sound of laughter swelled around me, but it rang hollow, distorted, like background noise in a nightmare. My chest tightened as I pictured what would happen if I did nothing, her laughter turning into sobs of pain, her little body curled in agony from food poisoning. I imagined hospital lights instead of wedding lights, panic instead of music, and my own guilt echoing louder than any lecture my family had ever given me. That was when the truth hit me with brutal force. If I stayed silent, I wouldn't just be complicit in my family's obsession with appearances. I would be complicit in their suffering, too. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I could almost feel my parents' voices in my head. Don't embarrass us. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin the day. But for the first time in my life, those words lost their power. The shame of speaking up could never compare to the shame of letting innocent people be harmed. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering in my ears, ready to call out to my niece to stop her. My aunt's hand shot out and caught my arm, nails digging into my skin. Her face was tight with panic. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely. "Do you hear me? Don't you dare make a fool of us." Once I'd made the choice to act, my fear didn't vanish, it shifted. It no longer paralyzed me. It sharpened me, like a blade being honed against a stone. I couldn't just scream in the middle of the hall and hope people would listen. I knew my family, they'd dismiss me, drown me out, and worse, turn the crowd against me before I'd said a full sentence. If I was going to stop this, I needed proof. Proof no one could ignore. I slipped away from the dance floor and headed toward the service corridor where the catering staff moved in and out with trays of food. My heels clicked softly against the tiles, my heart pounding with each step. The air back there was cooler, tinged with the scent of fish and garlic, sharp and undeniable. I caught sight of one of the waiters, a young man barely out of his teens, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. "Excuse me," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I ask you something? Has anyone said anything about the seafood tonight?" He blinked at me, surprised. Yeah, actually, the kitchen staff were arguing about it earlier. Something about it sitting out too long in delivery. But they said the head caterer told them to serve it anyway." My stomach dropped. That was it, the confirmation I needed. Not paranoia, not overreaction. The food was dangerous, and the people in charge knew it. I thanked him quickly and stepped aside, my mind racing. How could I use this? What would force everyone to listen? And then I remembered my phone. Not the photos, not the notes, but the recording app I often used to save voice memos at work. My unique weapon wasn't strength or authority. It was something far simpler: evidence. I waited until the next group of servers came through with trays of shrimp and scallops, their voices carrying in the narrow corridor. I slipped my phone from my clutch and tapped record, holding it casually at my side. "Man, I wouldn't touch this stuff," one muttered to the other. "Smells off to me." "Yeah, but boss said keep quiet. Rich folks don't notice anyway," The other replied with a laugh. My chest tightened, but I held still, letting them pass, every word etched into the recording. When the corridor quieted, I ended the clip and played it back, just to be sure. Clear, audible, irrefutable. I stared at the glowing screen, my hands trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline. I had it, the weapon, the one thing that could pierce through my family's obsession with appearances. Still, I knew it wouldn't be enough to simply wave my phone around and yell. If I came across as hysterical, no one would care about the facts. I had to be deliberate, calm, strategic. The plan began to crystallize in my mind. I would time my move so that the recording was heard by the right people at the right moment. If I could get the venue manager or the groom's family to hear it, they would have no choice but to intervene. Once they acted, my family's opinion would no longer matter. I took a deep breath and tucked my phone back into my clutch. The decision was final. The battle wasn't just mine anymore. I had the truth, and the truth was enough. For the first time that night, I felt steady, like I had stepped out of a storm and onto solid ground. Little did I know, the storm was only just beginning. There are moments when everything slows down and the world seems to narrow to one bright line of action. Standing in that service corridor with my phone still warm from the recording, I felt that narrowing like a tide pulling me forward. All the noise, the ants' whispers, my parents' silent disapproval, the clink of glasses out in the hall fell away. There was one clear thing to do: make the facts impossible to ignore. First, I told myself to breathe. Panic would make me babble, and babbling would let them dismiss me as emotional. I smoothed my dress, squared my shoulders, and walked back toward the ballroom with measured steps. The hall looked the same: crystal chandeliers, laughing guests, a string quartet playing a waltz that felt cruelly light compared to the weight in my hands. But I moved with an odd sense of purpose. I wasn't rushing. I was taking control. My target was the head caterer. He was a man who loafed through crises with a practiced grin. I'd seen him at other family events, always confident that no one would call him to account. He was currently bent over a clipboard, barking quiet instructions to a server about timing. I approached him and kept my voice steady. "Excuse me," I said. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" He looked up, the smile automatic. "Of course, ma'am. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, and I let the word land. "I think some of the seafood is spoiled. I have a recording of staff talking about it. I don't want to cause trouble, but I will call the health department if people are served." He blinked. For a second, a flicker of color drained from his face and his mouth tightened. That was the tiny, human honesty I'd been hoping for, something behind the smile that acknowledged consequence. But he tried to recover fast. "Ma'am, we've managed events like this for years. The guests won't." "I'm not arguing about experience," I interrupted quietly. "I'm offering you a chance to do the right thing before anyone gets sick. Listen." I set my phone on the edge of a prep table and tapped play. The corridor filled with the young servers' voices, casual, careless, exactly what I needed. "Man, I wouldn't touch this stuff," the recording said. "Smells off to me." The head caterer's mask slipped. He looked around as if the walls might have ears. I waited in the space the recording had carved. He swallowed. We can send it back to the kitchen." "Maybe it's fine, you can't serve it," I said. "If the health department hears that your staff knew and were told to serve anyway, you could lose your license. The venue could be shut down. More important people could get seriously ill." I kept my voice level. "Statements, not pleas." He laughed, a short, brittle sound. "You really think I want that?" Of course not. But you should understand this would cause a scene. The bride is safe or is not safe, I said, cutting off the rehearsal of excuses. I'm not here to ruin her day. I'm here to protect it. He hesitated. Then, as if feeling the logic close around him, gave an order to the nearest server. Pull those trays. Replace them with the alternatives in the cooler. Now, his voice still held the old smoothness, but it was edged with a new worry. Relief wasn't immediate. I'd bought a moment, perhaps the right one, but I'd also painted a target on myself. As the staff moved, whispering and shuffling, a junior manager caught sight of me and frowned. What did you say to him? She asked sharply. I told him there's a health risk, I replied. If he serves spoiled seafood, people will get sick. Her eyes narrowed, taking in my family's tense faces across the room. I could feel their gaze, a physical thing, a pressure that made my ears hot. For a second I feared they'd come at me with outrage. Instead, something else happened. A murmur, then more murmurs. Guests began to notice the trays being removed. A server went out to the buffet line and quietly placed new dishes, steamed vegetables, cold cuts that had been kept safely chilled, bowls of rice and salads in the place of the seafood. That was the first, small victory. The caterer had acted, but I wasn't done. People talk fast in the face of potential scandal. The rumor mill could spin this into something ugly about our family, and I still had to manage that side of it. The last thing I wanted was for people to remember the wedding for a shouting match instead of a save. So I did what I'd practiced in my head for the last 10 minutes. I walked back to the head table and found the groom's mother, someone who, I knew from family dynamics, had more authority in the room than my aunt or my parents. Her face was slack with the strain of hosting, her fingers absently twisting a napkin. I approached her with my calmest voice and the firmest facts. Mrs. Ahmad, I said, I'm sorry to bother you. I don't want to alarm anyone, but I have a recording of staff saying the seafood smelled off and that they were told to serve it. The head caterer has already pulled those trays, but I'm going to call the health department. I thought you should know. She stared at me for a long beat, as if weighing the accusation against the decorum of the evening. Then she nodded once, slow and decisive. Call them, she said. Now, her decision changed everything. She had weight in the room in a way my protests never would. When she stood, thanked me softly, and walked toward the venue manager with me in tow, people stopped and watched. You could feel the tide shift. I took my phone out again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I dialed the local health department number, something I'd quickly looked up earlier that week, when a friend had needed it for a small food safety concern. The irony surprised me. The very habit of being prepared for practicalities in life had given me the tool to act. I explained the situation, and the woman on the other end was professional and efficient. She asked very specific, pointed questions. What did they smell like? How long had the food been out? Who had said what? I answered each question calmly, playing the recording once more into the phone. Her tone shifted as she listened. Words like immediate and inspection slipped into the conversation. She promised to send someone out and asked me to remain available for testimony. I hung up with a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread for what could happen if the caterer was negligent in other ways. Relief because there was now an official ear on the matter. While we waited for the inspector, the caterer approached me, his earlier bravado wholly drained. We'll cover any extra costs, he muttered. We'll make sure everyone has food. I'm sorry for the trouble. Thank you, I said simply. I didn't need an apology. I needed action, and he had provided it. A few minutes later, the inspector arrived, a small, brisk woman with a clipped haircut and a badge that said environmental health. She walked through the kitchen, nose wrinkling as she did the work she was trained to do. In the end, she made a few notes, asked a couple of pointed questions about delivery times and storage logs, and then told the caterer not to serve any seafood that had been left unrefrigerated. The caterer signed, looked at me, then looked down. His shame was a private thing, a small, human consequence. Across the hall, guests continued to eat. Now reassured by the visible action, people thanked the staff for the fresh dishes, and a few came up and said thank you to me, simple words that felt enormous. My cousin, the bride, pulled me into a quick hug in the middle of the night, her voice squeezed with gratitude. "You saved us," she whispered. My parents' faces had gone through an arc that night, first fury, then confusion, and finally a kind of stunned silence as the facts settled. They had been so sure that silence would preserve the family's image. Ironically, it was my refusal to be silent that did. When I finally sat down an hour later, with a plate of the substitute food in front of me, I felt hollowed out and oddly buoyant at the same time. The room hummed with conversation, the music started up again, and the night went on, but it did so because someone chose to act, to put truth ahead of reputation. That night taught me a lesson about leverage and dignity. My phone recording wasn't dramatic. It was proof. My calm was not weakness. It was strategy. And in the tight, expensive world of weddings, the thing people fear most, being caught wrong, was the very thing that forced the caterer to fix his mistake. I had used their fear of consequence as the instrument of safety. The plan had worked, but I also knew that consequences were rarely limited to one person. The caterer would face fines, the venue might be inspected more closely, and family gossip would do its work. I had protected the guests. Now I had to live with whatever fallout came next. The inspector's presence had shifted the mood in the ballroom. Guests were still laughing and eating, but there was an undercurrent now, a subtle hum of curiosity. People whispered, glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me. The secret was out, though not fully spoken. Something had gone wrong with the food, and somehow, I was in the middle of it. My family noticed too. I could feel the heat of their stares long before the confrontation began. My mother was the first to cross the room. Her steps were clipped, her lips pressed so tightly together they were almost white. She leaned down toward me, hissing so only I could hear, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I met her eyes. For years, I had lowered mine in these moments, choosing silence to keep the peace. But not this time. "Yes," I said. "I stopped 100 people from being poisoned." Her face flushed, a quick flash of anger that she smoothed over as guests glanced our way. "You've embarrassed us," she whispered. "At your cousin's wedding, people will talk. Better they talk about pulled seafood than ambulances parked outside." I replied evenly. That was when my aunt, the bride's mother, joined us. Unlike my mother, she didn't lower her voice. Her words were sharp, aimed to wound. "How dare you insert yourself into my daughter's wedding like this? You always need to be the center of attention, don't you?" The accusation stung, but it was so absurd I almost laughed. I kept my voice calm, though inside my heart was pounding. "Your daughter thanked me, Auntie. She knows what could have happened." My aunt scoffed, waving a jeweled hand dismissively. "You're exaggerating. It was just food. People would have been fine." I didn't need to answer. At that very moment, the health inspector stepped out from the kitchen with the caterer trailing behind her. She addressed the venue manager in a clear, professional tone that carried across the room. "All seafood has been removed from service due to improper storage and risk of foodborne illness." The catering company will be cited for violations. Guests are advised not to consume any that was already served. The room fell into stunned silence. Forks froze midair. Conversations cut off. Every guest had heard. My aunt's face went slack, her mouth opening and closing without sound. My mother's eyes darted around, searching desperately for some escape from the humiliation. And the caterer, his downfall was sharp and visible. His practiced grin was gone, replaced by a sweaty, ashen look as he realized what this meant. He would not just face fines. His reputation was crumbling in real time. In front of wealthy clients who had the power to ruin his business with a few phone calls. One guest muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "I knew something tasted off." Another chimed in, "Unbelievable, they could have sent us all to the hospital." Soon, the room was buzzing with outrage, not at me, but at the caterer. In my aunt's attempt to paint me as dramatic fell apart in seconds. The irony was delicious. Her obsession with appearances had blinded her, but now her perfect wedding was publicly saved by the very person she'd tried to silence. The caterer stammered an apology into the microphone he'd grabbed from the DJ, his voice cracking. We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. And rest assured, we are replacing everything with the highest quality alternatives." But it was too late. His downfall was complete. Guests whispered about lawsuits, about never hiring him again. The inspector had the final word, and no amount of charm could undo it. And my family, they stood there, exposed in their hypocrisy. For all their threats and scolding, the truth had spoken louder than they ever could. They had tried to bury me under the weight of "don't embarrass us." But now their silence had almost caused catastrophe. My refusal to stay quiet was the only reason the night hadn't ended in disaster. I looked at my mother, who still hadn't sat down. For once, she had no words. That silence was its own kind of justice. The tables had turned. The caterer's business was in ruins. My aunt's haughty superiority cracked, and my parents forced to face the truth they'd worked so hard to ignore. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small or silenced. I felt powerful, and it wasn't because I shouted the loudest, it was because I stood on the side of truth, calmly, firmly, and without apology. The inspector's announcement still hung in the air like smoke after a firework. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it, and there was no taking it back. The caterer was ruined. My aunt was speechless, and my parents stood frozen in their own shame. But the true payoff came in the moment that followed. When the truth shifted from whispers to open acknowledgement, the bride, my cousin, found me. She was radiant in her gown, but her hands trembled as she reached for mine. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not of anger, but of overwhelming relief. "You saved us," she whispered fiercely, her voice breaking. "I don't care what anyone else says, you saved my wedding." Those words, spoken loudly enough for the nearest guests to hear, cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Heads turned. People began nodding, murmuring their agreement. One guest raised his glass toward me and said, "She's the reason we're all safe tonight." Another chimed in, "That was brave." Most people wouldn't have spoken up. The applause began as a ripple, tentative, almost shy. But it grew, spreading across the hall until a wave of clapping filled the room. 200 people, all acknowledging that the wedding could have ended in disaster if not for me. And there I stood, no longer the anxious niece being told to keep quiet, no longer the embarrassment my family feared I would be. In that moment, I was the protector, the one who had chosen truth over silence, courage over convenience. My aunt's face burned crimson as she watched her own guests applaud me. My parents shifted uncomfortably, clearly desperate for the ground to swallow them whole. They had scolded me for embarrassing them, but now, the irony was complete. The only reason their reputations weren't destroyed was because I had ignored their command. The final blow came not from me, but from the bride herself. She turned to the crowd, still holding my hand, and said, "Let's all take a moment to thank her for saving us from what could have been a nightmare." I will never forget this. The room erupted in another wave of clapping, this time louder, warmer, undeniable. My aunt couldn't contradict her own daughter. My parents couldn't silence 100 voices. And the caterer head bowed, sweat dripping, slipped quietly out of the hall, the sound of his downfall echoing behind him. That was the moment. The moment I knew the battle was over. Not because I shouted, not because I fought for credit, but because the truth had been laid bare. And no one could deny it. I had saved 100 people from poisoned seafood. And in doing so, I had rewritten my place in my family's story. By the time the music swelled again and the dancing resumed, the wedding had found its rhythm once more. Guests laughed, ate safely, and toasted the bride and groom with renewed joy. Outwardly, it looked like any other wedding celebration, but beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted for me, for my family, and for those who had witnessed it all. The caterer's downfall was immediate and irreversible. Word spread faster than the music could cover it. Guests muttered about lawsuits, refunds, and blacklisting him from every future event. Within days, I learned he had lost contracts with other families in the community. His name had become synonymous with negligence. It wasn't my voice alone that destroyed him. It was his own arrogance and greed, amplified by his carelessness. He had thought no one would notice, and that very assumption had undone him. My aunt, humiliated, tried to pretend it had never happened. She avoided the subject in the weeks that followed, focusing instead on the professional photographs and carefully edited videos of the wedding. But the truth had already taken root in people's memories. It was my intervention, not her planning, that had saved the night. For all her obsession with appearances, she couldn't erase that fact. The irony was perfect. Her greatest fear had been embarrassment, and it came not from me, but from her own refusal to act. My parents struggled more quietly. At first, they avoided eye contact with me, unable to reconcile their scolding words with the reality of what I had done. But gradually, their silence turned into something else, an awkward respect, almost reluctant admiration. They never apologized outright, not in so many words. But I noticed the difference. At family gatherings afterward, when someone made a snide remark about me being too outspoken, my mother no longer joined in. She changed the subject instead. That small shift told me everything. And as for me, I carried something new after that night, a certainty I hadn't known I possessed. For years, I had been told to stay quiet, to keep my head down, to avoid rocking the boat. I had believed that doing so was the price of peace. But the wedding proved the opposite. Silence isn't peace if it allows harm to fester. Speaking up had been terrifying, but it had also been right. I realized that my voice was not a liability. It was a gift. From that night forward, I stopped apologizing for it. I no longer felt guilty for noticing things others ignored, or for pointing out uncomfortable truths. And when someone tried to shame me with those familiar words, "Don't embarrass us," I remembered the applause of 200 people who knew the truth. The new normal wasn't dramatic. It was simple. I trusted myself. I spoke when something mattered, even if it ruffled feathers. And I carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the moment came, I had chosen courage over compliance. The moral was clear. Appearances fade, but truth remains. And sometimes, The very thing others fear will embarrass them is the only thing that can save them.